days ago, she was speaking at the United Nations, where she received their Champion of the Earth Award. Time Magazine, yeah. Time Magazine, 100 most influential people in the world. Foreign Policy, list of 100 leading global thinkers. She's been on that list twice. She's got 2 honorary doctorates in addition to her learned doctorate. She's won enough Texas Tech Awards to make us all stand up and sing the Matador fight song. So would you join me in welcoming Dr. Catherine Hayhoe?
What I want to talk about is I want to talk about all the myths that we hear ourselves. We might hear them in church, we might hear them on the radio, we might see them on a website, somebody might say them to us. And we often hear people say things to us like, you know, even if climate is changing, God is in control, not humans. And it's just a natural cycle anyways. We have dominion over the earth, and it's a false earth-worshipping religion. Those scientists are all godless liberal atheists. People matter more than the planet, and God said he would never flood the earth again. I'm not going to ask for a show of hands because I'm pretty sure if you're like me, you've heard all of these, right? I've heard all of these, every single one. In fact, I get them just about every week. So I want to talk through these things because, of course, there's grains of truth in everything that we hear. So I want to start with the first one that's very near and dear to my own heart, and that is, are scientists all godless liberal atheists? Now, this is a fascinating question, and yesterday we had a panel with Elaine Eklund, who is not only a fellow believer, but she is also a sociologist at Rice University, and you may have heard her before, and if you don't, living in Houston, you'll have a chance to again since she is here. So she actually studies this, and often we sort of think that people who identify with a specific faith, or we'd call them believers, and research scientists have a very, very small overlap. In fact, that overlap is occupied primarily by this. But Elaine, and this is Elaine thought to herself, is this true? So she surveyed 1,700 scientists at top universities across the US, not Christian colleges, secular universities. And she found that 50% of people who are scientists identify with a specific religious label. I am a Christian, I am a Protestant, I'm a Catholic, I'm Orthodox, I'm evangelical, I'm Jewish, I'm Hindu, I'm Buddhist. 50% of us identify with a religious label. 70% of us consider ourselves to be spiritual people. Probably not the number you thought, was it? And then she was most fascinated by the fact that, so you've got 30% left who consider themselves to be atheists or agnostics, and of that, 20% of them consider themselves to be spiritual atheists. Really interesting, isn't it? So research scientists and people who specifically say, I am a, mostly Christian in the US, are actually 50%. Isn't that interesting? So you can't say anymore those scientists are all godless liberal atheists. In fact, when I first started to tell people and share with people that I was a Christian, which I did through writing a book with my husband together, who's a pastor, so I can't go to a meeting, a scientific meeting or conference or even a project meeting anymore without having at least 1 or 2 colleagues come up to me and say, I'm a Christian too. I get emails and messages almost every week. In fact, I just got one yesterday from someone saying, I really appreciate what you're doing. I'm a scientist. This is what I studied. I just want to let you know I'm a Christian too. So what about a more thorny issue? This whole global warming, climate change thing, it's a false earth-worshipping religion. And we Christians have dominion over the earth anyway, so we can do whatever we want. This is something that we hear all the time. We hear it from our politicians. They tell us who did it. And if we go to the internet, you know the internet has proof for everything. If you go to the internet, here's the proof. Just yesterday, in a news outlet called The Federalist, they ran a story yesterday that was called Climate Worship is Nothing More Than Rebranded Paganism. The left created the climate crisis to worship it. Which reminds you of what? The golden calf, right? Moses went up the mountain, and when he came down, they had melted down everything they had, and they had made a calf, and were worshiping it. So often people ask me, as some visitors to our church did last year when we went out for lunch with them and they found out that the pastor's wife was a climate scientist, they say, do you believe in global warming? And my answer is no. I said, no, I don't believe in it. And then often people say, but you're a climate scientist, how do you not believe in it? I said, well, because the Bible tells us what the definition of belief or faith is. In Hebrews, it talks about how faith or belief is the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of what we do not see. Over 2,000 years ago, there was a baby born in a manger. You could see the physical baby, but we could not see with our eyes the fact that he was the Son of God. Yet that's what we believe, isn't it? We could see that that baby grew to be a man and died a horrible death on the cross. You could see that with your eyes. But what we could not see, but what we believe, is that he died for the forgiveness of our sins. And then, 3 days later, he rose, and they could see the empty tomb with their eyes, and they couldn't believe it. They said, what have you done with the body? But what we believe is something truly crazy. We believe that he actually rose again to give us new life, a new spiritual life, taking us from death into life. This is what we believe. So every Sunday school child learns what God's greatest gift is. And we talk about it especially around Christmas. So that's coming up. What is God's greatest gift? God's greatest gift to us is his son. But I don't know about you, but I have never attended a sermon, a talk, a lecture, a Sunday school class, a workshop that talked about what God's second greatest gift might be. Now, I'm not going to say that I know what it is for sure. You could make an argument for it being his Holy Spirit. You could argue for a few other things. But I'm going to suggest to you that somewhere on that list, near number 1 or 2 or 3, or 2 or 3, would be the idea that one of God's greatest gifts to us was the planet. Because not only did Christ come as an actual physical human being to give us new spiritual life, but it was very important that he came as a physical being. And there was a heresy, a Gnostic heresy in the early church, saying that the physical didn't matter. And so the Apostle John wrote very strongly countering this, and he said, we have seen with our eyes, we have touched with our hands. Jesus was real, he was physical. So would we consider that perhaps the planet, which is the perfect home for life, is one of the greatest gifts that God has given us, to give us our physical life, which matters to God so much that his son became a physical human on this planet. And if we believe, as most of us do as Christians, if we believe that God created this planet that we live on, and in fact created this incredible universe that it's placed in, then what is science other than studying God's creation? And how could science possibly be in conflict with what God has created? It even talks about this in Romans. It says, for ever since the world was created, we've seen the earth and the sky. Through everything God made, we can clearly see what? We can see God. In what? In nature, in creation, through our science. And it even says we have no excuse for not knowing God if we look at his creation. There's many scientists who have come to belief in God through studying science. Francis Collins is one of the most well-known of these. He decoded the human genome. In his studies in evolutionary biology, he came to believe in a God. He wrote a wonderful book about that called The Language of God. He now heads the National Institutes of Health. There's cosmologists like George Smoot who came to belief in God through studying the beginning of the universe. So God reveals himself to us. And if I were back when the author of Hebrews was writing this book, if I was back then, I would have jogged their elbow and I would have said, you forgot the second half of the verse. Because the second half of the verse is clearly that science is the substance of things that are here and now, the evidence of what we can observe. And the fascinating thing is that when you go to Google, of course being the arbiter of our modern age, you go to Google and they've actually done studies that show that we retain less information in our brains now because we know that we can Google it. Isn't that kind of scary? When you go to Google, it actually gives us a very similar definition to Hebrews. It says, faith is a strong belief based on spiritual apprehension rather than proof, whereas science is the systematic study of the structure and behavior of the physical and natural world. Through what? Through observing with your eyes and through touching and experimenting with your hands. So when we think of our planet, we recognize it as a gift. It is not something to worship. If somebody who you love gives you a gift, do you worship the gift? No, you have a relationship with the person, right? So it's not about depreciating the gift. It's about appreciating it because it comes from someone who we love more than anyone in the world. We were not created to float around in outer space like an astronaut. And the only way we can survive in outer space is if we're actually using things that we got from Earth to keep us safe. Because this Earth gives us the air that we breathe right now. Just take a breath. That breath comes from this planet that God created for us, which is our perfect home. The water that we drink, that we need, comes from our home. All of the food we eat, all of the materials that we use to build everything, including the homes that we live in, comes from this earth. But it isn't only about physical needs. The beauty of the earth also comes from God. The amazing beauty that we can look at and we can appreciate and that we feel often that heals our soul, that comes from God too. And originally, I was studying astrophysics originally, and part of my inspiration was my father, who's a science educator himself, who talks about the universe as God's art gallery. That when you look at the nebula and the galaxies, the incredible modern art in our universe that God created, that for so long he was the only one who could see, but now thanks to telescopes we can see them too. The beauty is an important part of that. So on the spectrum of perspectives on our home, at one end of that spectrum we certainly would have some people who worship it. But what I would argue to you is that at the opposite end of the spectrum we have people who treat it like garbage. And where should we be as Christians? Well, Genesis actually answers this question. Genesis tells us exactly where we should be. In Genesis 1, it talks about how God made humans in his image. And we again hear Sunday school classes about this. We hear sermons about this. We memorize this verse. But how often do you ever see the "so that" there? Did you know that God created us in his image for a reason? For what reason were we created like that? To be responsible for every living thing that moves on the face of the earth. That was why God created us in this way. And the word responsible is the one that is translated, in the Hebrew it's rada. I'm not a Hebrew scholar, many people here are, so excuse me for the translation. But the word rada is translated as dominion often, but not domination. Authority or rule, or even to exercise skilled mastery with respect to. So for context, now people take this to say, well, that means we can do whatever we want, right? For context, let's look at Matthew, where Jesus is explaining the difference between the godless rulers versus the rulers who rule in a way that's acceptable to God, and it uses the same word. The exact same word, rada, is used here. Ready? You've observed how the godless rulers throw their weight around. This is the message. I love the message because it puts a bit of color on things. They throw their weight around, how quickly a little power goes to their head. It is not going to be that way with you. Whoever wants to be great must become a servant. Whoever wants to be first must be a slave. That is what the Son of Man has done. He came to serve, not to be served. So that's our picture of the leadership and the responsibility and the rule that God has given us. And then in Genesis 2, it actually goes on to talk specifically about how God took man and put him in the garden to cultivate and keep, which are the Hebrew words abad and shamar. And those can be translated as serving and protecting or guarding or keeping. So imagine if someone who you love and respect more than anyone in the world, they said, I am going to give you a piece of property which I love, I have carefully designed, I have maintained, I have invested in. I know every blade of grass on this property. I know every animal, insect, and bird on this property. It is a prosperous farm that produces crops, that feeds people, that gives people jobs, that provides a safe home and a safe habitat for people. I'm going to give you rule over this piece of land to serve, protect, and keep this land. And you say, thank you very much. And then you take that land and you extract every cent of value from that land and you leave it a smoking, devastated ruin. What does that say about how we truly feel? about the person who gave it to us. Whereas if we take that land and we also invest in it, and we make sure it thrives, and the soil is healthy, and it produces crops, and it gives people jobs, and it provides a safe place for people to live, and it has woods, and it has places where animals and birds can live too, how does that fulfill our responsibility to guard or to keep? So this is where the concept of creation care comes from. The idea of caretaking, guarding, stewarding, being responsible for. And on a spectrum, we often think, well, okay, so we don't want to be the people who say, well, humans are exactly the same as any other living thing. And people say, well, the earth would be better off without us anyway, so maybe we just need to get rid of humans. I hear that, and that is what some people believe. That is not our perspective. But at the opposite end of the spectrum, I would say that it is not our perspective either, that of ego, that of being at the top, that of standing on the rest of creation. Because what image does the Bible use for when we put our feet on something? When an enemy is defeated, the kings would put their feet on them and use them as a footstool, and that's an image used in the Old Testament. But that is not the image that Jesus just talked about in Matthew. He talked about us being a servant leader, about us being the slave and serving. And so where I think we don't fall at that end of the spectrum. We don't believe that humans are equal to every other living thing on this planet, and in fact, we'd be better off without us. But as Christians, we have fallen into the trap of believing ourselves to be the top of the pyramid, the superior beings, standing and putting our feet on God's creation. And instead, I would suggest to you that perhaps we're here. We are supporting, we are caring for, and what's that shape? We're loving every living thing that God has given us. And it talks in Galatians, the Apostle Paul talks about the fact that we're called for freedom. So what does that mean? It means we can do what we want because God has given us freedom, has given us free will. But don't use this as an opportunity for what? For selfishness, for greed, for me-firstism. Use it as an opportunity to serve one another through love, for the whole law is fulfilled in one statement, namely, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And as we say in Texas, where we publish the Bible on road signs, that love thy neighbor thing, I really meant it, sign God. So while there are people who say we worship the earth, and while there are people who say we have dominion over the earth so we can leave it a smoking ruin, it doesn't matter, we'll just push the eject button when we're done, we know that as Christians we belong to neither of those ends of the spectrum. We know that we have a special role, we know that we have responsibility, and we know that God has given us that responsibility to care for others. So now let's look a little bit more at the science, because I am a scientist, and I hear a lot of these almost every single day. It is rare for me not to hear a sciencey sounding argument, so I wanted to go into a little bit of the science with you here. How do we know that this thing is even happening, right? And in fact, if you look at sciencey sounding arguments, I have a whole other page, so we're just gonna look at a whole other page here. It's just a natural cycle. We haven't studied it long enough to be sure. You scientists are making the whole thing up to line your pockets with government grants. It's a pretty common one. I once actually got that. I was speaking to a society of petroleum geologists in Midland, Texas, and one man actually stood up and accused me of doing this, and so I said I would be happy to compare our tax returns. And at the time, I was lucky to make $55,000 a year. I've considered myself very fortunate to make that amount, and he declined that offer. It's not happening. It's cooling, or sea levels are falling, or it's such a tiny amount of carbon dioxide you're talking about. How could that affect the planet that's as big as this? Or it's really just the sun. Don't you know that's where our energy comes from? So in between the months of November and April, even in Lubbock, Texas, and you might hear this in Houston too, probably one of the most frequent arguments I hear is, it's cold outside. Where is global warming now? But weather is what our brains are made to remember. Our brains remember weather. We remember weather stories. Do you have a weather story? How could you live in Houston and not have a weather story? I'm sorry. I'm working with the city of Houston right now, and so we did our first meeting in August last month where we brought in people from the community to collect people's weather stories, and oh my goodness, yes. But weather is what happens in a certain place at a certain time. It's like a single tree, And climate is like a forest. It's the average statistics of weather over at least 20 to 30 years. So for example, some people have no children, some people have 1 or 2 children, some people have 8 or 10 children. That's weather. But we know the average somehow across the US is 2.4 children. That's climate. So when we say it's cold today, in the place where I live, it's cold today, so the entire planet cannot be warming over climate timescales, which is at least 20 to 30 years. It's sort of as if we're on the Titanic, and we're saying, well, it can't be sinking because my end just went 200 feet up in the air. You have to look at the whole ship to figure out what's going on. And then people say too, oh, but those thermometers, those scientists are faking the data on the thermometers or the satellites or the ocean buoys or whatever they're using. Well, first of all, if that was really happening, they'd have to be faking data going all the way back to 1600s, because that's how long the thermometer record goes back, to the Civil War in England. They started the first thermometer record in the 1600s. You are talking about an Illuminati scale conspiracy for people to be faking global temperature data in every country around the world for 400 years. That's a pretty big conspiracy. But regardless of that, you know what I say? I say throw out all the thermometer data. Throw out all of the ocean buoys and the satellites. Because if you simply look at God's creation, the evidence is all around us. I was just up in Alaska where everywhere you look, you can see the evidence right in front of your eyes. People who'd lived there their whole lives took us to the glacier and they said, this is what the glacier looked like. And now there's a giant lake. And those lakes weren't supposed to be there, so they're bursting their bounds. And there was one town that had a drought, a wildfire, and a flood from the melting glacier at the same time this summer. There was mountains where if you live in Juneau, you can look out and see the mountains, the Tongass Mountains, on the horizon. And it's been warming so fast that for the last 3 summers, the top of the mountains have been snow-free, and human eyes have seen that mountains for the first time. In Japan, they've been tracking when the cherry trees flower for over 1,000 years because they have a cherry tree festival. Those trees are now flowering 3 weeks earlier in the year than they have in 1,100 years of history. Up in the Arctic, the ground is thawing, the sea levels are rising, and here in Texas, we're even seeing change. So one of my colleagues is a biologist at Texas Tech University. He is also a person of faith. He's a Catholic, and we do a lot of things together because we're very much on the same page on this. And he planted a peach tree in his backyard when he first moved to Lubbock 30 years ago. Being a scientist, he wrote down the date the peach tree flowered every year. And when he had to cut it down a few years ago, because often fruit trees get to the end of their life, when he had to cut it down, it was flowering 3 weeks earlier on average than when he planted it. And if you look at the USDA plant hardiness zone, which if you're gardeners, you know about the plant hardiness zone, it's what type of plants you can plant when. I see a few people nodding. According to the plant hardiness zone, Lubbock, Texas now feels like Austin did just 25 years ago for plants. Now, the music didn't come with, and neither did the restaurants. So we're hoping that those will start migrating as well. There's some signs of hope there. So all told, when we look at God's creation, some of which is happening right in our own backyards, all told, when we look at the ants and the bees and the insects and the birds and the trees moving northward or flowering earlier or changing their migration patterns, when we look at the sea level rising and the glaciers thawing, when we look at all of these things in God's creation, do you know how many independent lines of evidence there are that the planet is warming? Yeah. So we know that, yes, the planet really is warming. But then you have to ask why. Because people often come up to me, and I get this, multiple times a week. They say, don't you know it's been warmer before? And I say, how do you think you know that? Because a scientist told you. That usually doesn't go over so well. Is climate changing? Why is it changing is the question, because we do know that climate's changed in the past. So when we see climate changing, this may be a surprise to some people, we scientists who spend more time studying natural variability than we do the human influence on climate. We spend about 2/3 of our time studying natural variability. And we spend about 1/3 maybe studying humans on average. So when we do, we don't automatically jump on the bandwagon and say it has to be humans. We have to look at the natural causes first. It would be as if you were running a fever, a low-grade fever that went up and down from day to day, but week after week after week, it crept higher and higher, and you went to the doctor, and the doctor took one look at you and shouted, "It's Ebola!" You'd be like, you haven't even done the test. How do you know it's not the flu or food poisoning or, heaven forbid, leukemia? You gotta look at the natural suspects first. You don't just jump to something that's foreign and strange. So we know in the past that climate has changed, and we know that we get all of our energy, almost all of our energy, from the sun. We get a tiny, tiny, tiny bit from the Earth's core, which is hot, but most of it comes from the sun. So when we see the Earth's temperature, which goes up and down from year to year, that's weather, but decade after decade after decade after decade, it is going up. When we see the Earth's temperature going up, the first place we look is the sun. And when we look at the sun's energy, this is what we see. First of all, the sun's energy has an 11-year cycle that was discovered by Galileo. But when you look across the average, you see the sun's energy has actually been going down since the 1970s. So if we were controlled by the sun right now, we would be getting cooler, not warmer. Can't be the sun. It's as if you were turning up a lamp and it was getting colder. Or you were turning down a lamp, I should say, and it was getting brighter. That makes no sense. It can't be the sun. So could it possibly be natural cycles? Well, we study natural cycles, and they're fascinating things to study. What natural cycles are is they're like a teeter-totter or a seesaw. Now, just out of curiosity, how many people would call this a teeter-totter? Oh, not that many. So seesaw? Seesaw? Okay, some people are acting like they've never heard of this before. Come on, come on. Everybody was young once. Let's do this again. Seesaw. Here we go. Okay, that's better. Thank you. Teeter-totter. Teeter-totter. Okay. Oh, that's about 50-50. Okay. All right. And if you still haven't heard of these things, just go out to a playground and find one, because they are very fun. So it's interesting. I don't always ask people this, but I'm always kind of a little bit curious, because you know how, have you seen those maps of the US where they talk about how we called them tennis shoes or sneakers or running shoes in different places? Well, there's only one place where everybody calls it a teeter-totter. Utah. Who knew? I had no idea. Now you know something. I've never seen that before, but when I went to Utah, one of the places I spoke, I asked, and every hand went up for teeter-totter. Anyways, natural cycles are like a seesaw or a teeter-totter, or whatever it is that you want to call it. What they do is they take heat and they move it around the climate system from north to south, east to west, ocean to atmosphere, and back again. Natural cycles can't create heat. That would violate conservation of energy. Energy can't come from nothing. All they do is move it around. So a classic example of a natural cycle was the medieval warm period, when all of the Vikings went on a cruise to Greenland. Now, actually, this was one of the most successful PR campaigns of the Middle Ages. Because was Greenland covered in a sheet of ice back then? Yes, it was. So they arrived in Greenland, and it's like, oops, there's no return boat. They were getting a little overpopulated. They thought they would move people along. But when we look at natural thermometers, which include tree rings and sediment cores and ice cores, natural thermometers in God's creation, we can reconstruct what temperature looked like during the medieval warm period, and it turns out that over the North Atlantic, so over Western Europe and the North Atlantic, it was warmer than average. So they did have a bit more green in Greenland during that time. But if you lived in Siberia, it would have been the medieval cold period. Because this is a natural cycle, and what do natural cycles do? They move heat back and forth from one part of the climate system to the other. Now, I already showed you that our air temperature is increasing. So if the whole planet is getting warmer, and it doesn't look like this, in fact, you know what it looks like today? It looks like, and this is on the same scale. I didn't change the scale. On the same scale, this is what today looks like. You might still say, well, it could be a natural cycle, because what if that heat is coming from the ocean, right? So if our atmosphere is getting warmer, if the heat content of our atmosphere is getting warmer, and it's a natural cycle, then the heat content of the ocean would have to be doing this, right? Heat would have to be coming from the ocean into the atmosphere, and that's how the atmosphere is warming. So we've actually been tracking heat content from the atmosphere and the ocean, and this is not what it looks like. This is just something I drew. This is not what it looks like. Here's what it actually looks like. Ready? Same colors. This green is the increase in the heat content of the atmosphere, and this blue is the increase in the heat content of the ocean. It's 20 times more. And we say, well, why aren't we talking about the ocean then? And my only answer is, I think because we're not dolphins. Because when we use thermometers to measure air temperature, we are only measuring the tip of the iceberg, and much more is happening in the ocean, and we're just not talking about it because we just don't live in the ocean. But believe me, it is affecting life in the ocean significantly. I was up in Alaska, like I said, and the native peoples there, who of course have hunted and cultivated the animals, the fish, the shellfish, and more for centuries, they see massive changes in the timing of the salmon, in the water quality, in people actually getting poisoned from shellfish because of pollution runoff now, in changes in the sea ice, so they can't go out and hunt anymore. They see what's happening in the ocean. So it can't be a natural cycle that's inside the climate system. But we know that there's one more type of natural cycle, and the reason we know it is because we've watched those Ice Age movies, whether you admit it or not. We know that there used to be an ice age, and it ended when a squirrel or a rodent was chasing a nut, and it broke off one piece of ice, and that was just like the first domino, and it just ended the Ice Age right there. We don't have the rodents in our calculations, but we do have everything else. And when we look at where we are in the orbital cycles that cause ice ages, orbital cycles are the fact that over time the Earth's orbit becomes more circular and then more elliptical and then more circular. And then also you know that the Earth is tilted like this, so it goes around the sun like this, spinning every day. Well, if you've ever spun a top, and I won't ask you if you call it something else. Most people know what a top is, right? Okay, good. I feel like we should have like some children's toys at the back in case you missed out on that part. If you spin a top, you know, it goes around really fast, but it also goes around like this, right? As it spins. Thank you. You know. So that's what our Earth does too, and that changes how sunlight falls on the Earth. And because part of the Earth is white ice, part is dark ocean, part is green forest, part is pretty reflective desert, we absorb or reflect more or less of the sun's energy depending on how far we're pointing towards or away from the sun. That's what causes the ice ages. So are we just getting warmer after the last ice age? Well, if we look at the history of our planet over the last 6,000 years, over the history of human civilization on this planet, it turns out that over the history of our civilization, over the last 6,000 years, our temperature was gradually cooling because you can calculate where we are in the ice age cycles, and where we are is in about 1,500 years, we should be getting another ice age. And that's no good for us. We don't want another ice age. So the fascinating thing, there's a scientist called Bill Rudiman who studies this. The fascinating thing is he found that just 400 or 500 years ago, we had started to stabilize climate because we developed agriculture, a lot of cows, sheep, and goats, cut down a lot of forests to plant fields. Because of that, we had just about perfectly stabilized climate, because what's the best temperature for us? The temperature that our civilization's used to, right? Not too hot, not too cold, just right, like Goldilocks. We had just about perfectly stabilized it, and then all of a sudden something happened. What happened 300 years ago? That was when we figured out how to dig up and burn coal and gas and oil to power our civilization. And you may say, well, but don't we already have a natural blanket of heat-trapping gases? And the answer is yes, and I can explain to you how this works with a 60-second cartoon. Here we go. Our happy planet already has a natural blanket of heat-trapping gases. The sun's energy shines down and heats up the Earth. It goes through this blanket like a window. The Earth heats up and gives off heat energy. And just like a blanket traps our body heat, this blanket of natural heat-trapping gases traps the Earth's heat, keeping us at just the right temperature for life. We would be 60 degrees Fahrenheit colder, and we'd be a frozen ball of ice without this amazing blanket that I believe was designed by God. So what's the problem if it's totally natural? It's that by digging up and burning coal and gas and oil, we're wrapping an extra blanket around our planet that it did not need. And just like when I used to go stay at my grandma's house when I was little, she would come in every night and put an extra blanket on me. And I would wake up every night sweating, saying, "Grandma, I didn't need the extra blanket. We do have central heating in Canada." In the same way, we're wrapping an extra blanket around our planet that does not need. And people may say, "Sure, but you're still talking about such a tiny amount. I mean, it's 0.04% of the content of the atmosphere you're talking about." And to that I would say, well, it's just a tiny amount of white powder I put in your glass. Is there a problem with that? Or in all seriousness, we all know that when we're sick, if we don't take a pill that's the size of our entire body, we won't get well. Not. We know that the potency is what matters, not the size. And these are very potent heat-trapping gases. So it can't be the sun, because if it is, we'd be getting cooler, not warmer. It can't be natural cycles like El Nino or the ones that caused the medieval warm period, because the whole planet is warming. It isn't just moving heat around. And it can't be the Earth's orbit, because the next thing coming there was another ice age. So then people might say, well, sure, but how do you know? Because this is new stuff. We know that you've only come up with this in the last decade or so, and you scientists are always changing your mind. First butter's good, then it's bad, then it's good. Coffee's good, bad, and good. Everybody's told to drink wine and eat olive oil, and then it turns out that's bad. So you scientists are always changing your mind. Oh yes, and this frustrates me too. I just figure everything I like is going to be good eventually, right? Just keep. Well, here's the interesting thing. We discovered this blanket that keeps us at the perfect temperature for life when Joseph Fourier in the 1820s went to Egypt with Napoleon and started to wonder why they were so hot wearing their dark coats when all of the people in Egypt were wearing light-colored robes and they were fine. That was what led him to realize we have a blanket that is keeping us 60 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than we should be otherwise. Then, in the 1850s, two scientists on opposite sides of the Atlantic, John Tyndall in the 1850s, and Eunice Foote, an amateur scientist in upstate New York, also in the 1850s, they actually identified the specific gases, carbon dioxide and methane, that were responsible for this blanket. And Eunice, with nothing more than a set of glass jars and her brilliant untrained mind, because in those days it was really hard for a woman to be a scientist, she speculated in a paper she wrote in 1856 that you can read. It is online thanks to Google. Google can be good for some things. You can read what she wrote in 1856, and she speculated that if carbon dioxide levels in our atmosphere were higher, our planet would be warmer. 1856. By the 1890s, we knew so much science that Arrhenius, who won the Nobel Prize for his work in chemistry, on the weekends, he decided for fun, he was going to calculate by hand how much the Earth would warm if we doubled levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. He did it by hand. It took him 2 years. After about a year and a half, around Christmas, his wife packed up the family and left him. And I take this very personally because I actually do this work myself. But we have computer models. So my family can witness, and they are here today, that I set up my simulations to run on the supercomputer at Texas Tech, and then we can go have dinner together. And then by the 1930s, a British engineer called Guy Callender had collected enough weather station data from around the world to actually measure the warming of the planet. So this is a really, really old science. But then you might say, well, I heard that some letter just came out with 30 or 50 or 500 or 30,000 scientists saying this isn't real. Well, first of all, an opinion is just an opinion, and we look at facts, not opinions. But when you look at titles like, 49 former NASA scientists send a letter disputing climate change, when you actually start to look at who these people are who signed the letter, a more accurate headline would be this one. It's sort of like saying I have a really good accountant and I want them to do my brain surgery. No offense to the accountant. If I wanted them to do my taxes, I would go to them. But you don't ask somebody who's not an expert to tell you what's really happening. So then people might say, yeah, but I've heard that there's been some studies published saying that climate isn't changing or humans aren't responsible, and there have been. There's been thousands of studies published saying that climate is changing and humans are responsible. But when we looked through the literature, we found 38 studies that have been published in the last 10 years that either said that climate was not changing or that humans were not responsible. So what we did was we took those 38 studies and we recalculated every single one of them from scratch. I was part of the team of 10 scientists who did this. From scratch. That is a thankless task. And when we recalculated them from scratch, we found at least one mistake, error, miscalculation, false assumption, missing factor in each one. And if you fixed that error, it brought it into line with every single other study. So we really, really, really have checked. And if you want more information on the science, I want to point you to one of my favorite resources, which is by a fellow believer named John Cook. It is called skepticalscience.com, and they address every single sciencey-sounding objection you've heard about. So I would encourage you to go there if you have more questions about that. But I want to talk now about the last thing on our list. And this one is very near and dear to my own heart. Because as I mentioned to you, I was studying astrophysics. Because what is more amazing than the fact that we can look for the first time with our human eyes at something that God created? You can see something new that no other human has seen except you and God. You can find something out about the way galaxies work, that God made it that way, and when you find it out, you're like, this is just the smartest, most amazing thing I've ever seen in my life. So I was on my way to a career in astrophysics, and I needed one more class to finish my degree before I went on to graduate school. So I looked around, and I'd already finished my minor in Spanish. I grew up as a missionary kid in South America, so the minor in Spanish was pretty easy. And then I'd already taken, children's literature and the kind of courses you take. I'd also taken a class on Byzantine architecture, Romanesque architecture, and the Gothic cathedral, so I appreciate the building we're in too. But over in geography, there was a brand new class on climate science, and I thought to myself, that looks interesting, why don't I take it? Now, up until that point, I thought that climate change was an environmental issue, that it matters to the environment, it matters to plants and animals, but it doesn't really matter to people. And I took that class, and my mind was completely changed. Because what I learned is that we, of almost every species on the planet, we, the ones holding up that heart, right, the ones who have the responsibility for every living thing on this planet, that we humans are some of the most vulnerable to a changing climate. That when you think of this issue, when you think of that image that everybody uses to talk about this issue, an image of something that is big and white and furry. Okay, it's got to be a polar bear, right? Yes. You think of the polar bear sitting on the piece of ice, and this is how I thought of climate change. I wish the polar bear's the best, but we have a lot of problems in this world. And if we have to pick between helping people versus helping the polar bears, I really prefer to help people. But what I found out was something that completely changed my trajectory and my life, and that is the fact that after the polar bear, we're the ones sitting on that iceberg, so to speak, that is melting rapidly under our feet. What do I mean by that? Well, when you look at where people live in the world, you look at the fact that a huge part of the world lives in poverty. And the darker the color here, the more people live in poverty. And you look at where people live in poverty and you say, well, surely we want to help these people. And a lot of these people also, just to be very clear, a lot of these people live in energy poverty. They don't have access to energy, which is what has prolonged our lives. You remember the Industrial Revolution I talked about? The Industrial Revolution was a tremendous benefit for us. Here is the average life expectancy in the UK from the 1700s until now. The red line at the bottom is starting at age 0. Our effective life expectancy has gone from 40 to 80 years. And there is one main reason for that, and the main reason is the Industrial Revolution. Because all of a sudden, we had technology. We had technological advances. We can have refrigeration. We have electricity. We have transportation. Most importantly, we have the medical advances that came with it. Our lives are twice as long, significantly better, much easier than they were before, and the number one reason for that is fossil fuels. It isn't just about the ease of our lives. Before fossil fuels, what did we use? We used animals. A woman's life was an endless cycle of drudgery. Laundry took all day, and that was in the days when people just owned 2 outfits. Child labor, and worst of all, slave labor. Fossil fuels were a big part of what enabled the North to win over the South, because they had industrialized with fossil fuels. So when we look at the fact that many people in the world still have very short life expectancies, many people in the world live in energy poverty, many people in the world live in outright poverty, we think to ourselves, and this is very much my thinking, we think, how can we prevent more suffering? And the obvious answer is, what worked for me works for everybody, right? So how did we minimize our suffering? It was fossil fuels. But when did we do this? We started our process 300 years ago. Now, pulling the plug on fossil fuels is not practical. It would cause us to suffer right now, right here. What are we using right now? How did I get here? Where does most of our energy come from? Well, in Texas, we're actually up to 19.2% of the electricity last year on the ERCOT grid in Texas comes from wind, mostly wind with some solar. But the global energy, over 80%, comes from fossil fuels, or actually I think 79.5% to be very precise. You can tell I'm a scientist. And when we look around the world, it's because we had the resources and the countries that are poor did not have the resources. When we look at known resources, and of course these are just the known ones, many of the unknown ones are in the Arctic still, the known resources are not in countries that need the energy. They're in the countries that have it and could sell it to those other countries if they had the money. But the biggest change is the fact that when you look at the new energy being installed around the world in countries that did not have it, in those energy poverty countries that we looked at today, for the last 5 years, more than 50% of new energy being installed around the world has not been energy that requires big power plants and transmission lines. And in fact, as of last year, we're up to 70% of new energy around the world being installed in places that did not have it before was wind, solar, tidal, hydrokinetic, which uses stream flow, geothermal, which uses the heat of the earth, biomass, and more. We need energy today more than ever, but we're starting to see that there's different ways to get it. And how does this connect to climate change? It connects to climate change because we still need energy. And energy has made our lives so much better. And if I could turn back the clock, I wouldn't change it because we needed the fossil fuels to get us to where we are here today. And I'm grateful for what they brought us. And I hope you are too. And if you aren't, just think about your life. It isn't about eating the paleo diet, it's about living the paleo lifestyle. I don't know if you volunteered for one of those TV shows, but I did not, sorry. I did not, and I would not either. We need energy, but today, not only is telling people that you need to do it the way we did it 300 years ago not the solution, it's like saying to them that, this is my great-grandma Lucy, back in the 1890s when she just got married, it's like saying we need to be investing in horses and buggies more when 10 years later we've got new technology. So the world is changing, and why does this matter to us? It matters to us because when you look at where those people live in poverty, there's one more map I haven't showed you yet. And the map I haven't showed you is where people are most vulnerable to the impacts of a changing climate. How are they vulnerable? The same way that we are here. We already have natural disasters. We already have flood and drought. We already have ice storms, severe storms, hurricanes, heat waves. We have everything, and in fact, in Texas, we get more than anywhere else. We have had over 105 disasters that have cost at least $1 billion since 1980 because of where we're physically located on the Gulf of Mexico, where we get hurricanes, far enough, close enough to the mountains that we get ice storms coming all the way down. We get everything naturally, so how are we being affected by a warming climate? It's loading the natural weather dice against us. What do I mean? I mean, we always have a chance of rolling a double six. And frankly, if we live in Texas, we already have 3 6s on our dice. If you live in Houston, make that 4. But decade by decade, climate change is sneaking in and taking another one of those numbers and replacing it with another 6. And then it's replacing it with a 7. If we look at the last 50 years in the United States, heavy rainfall has been increasing. Why? Because warmer air holds more water vapor. So when a storm comes along now in a warmer world, there's more water vapor sitting up there for that storm to pick up and dump on us than there was 50 or 100 years ago. So how does this translate into what we're seeing today? Well, if you live here in Houston, you know some places in the Houston area have seen not 1, not 2, not even 3, but some places have seen 4 500-year flood events in 1 decade. That's not a 500-year flood event anymore. Those are some serious loading of the weather dice against us. What other things are happening? We're seeing other impacts being exacerbated. So out west, they have wildfire. Is wildfire natural? 100%. Most of wildfire today, actually human ignition. But the numbers of wildfires have been pretty stable the last 20 to 30 years, ever since the Smokey the Bear campaign. It actually really helped with ignition. But as it gets hotter and drier, wildfires are burning greater area. In December 2017, the Thomas Fire burned the largest area on record in California, but that record was broken by the Ranch Fire in the summer, and it was smashed by the Camp Fire in November. We know, and this is some work that I've done for the National Climate Assessment that was released just this past year, we know that without a changing climate, there would have been 11 million acres burned by wildfire in the western US since 1980. But the dice are being loaded against us, and so we're seeing more than twice the area being burned as the world gets hotter and drier. What about hurricanes? Are hurricanes getting more frequent? You might think they were if you were here in 2017. How many people were here in 2017? Yes. You might think they are, but they're not. Hurricanes aren't getting more frequent. So does that mean they're not being affected? No, the dice are being loaded there too. Remember what I said? Warmer air holds more water vapor, so when a storm comes along, there's a lot more water vapor for it to sweep up and dump on us. Hurricanes are very big storms, very big. It's estimated that 40% of the rainfall during Hurricane Harvey would not have come if the same hurricane had occurred 100 years ago. Remember the Galveston hurricane in 1900? Hurricanes are normal. They hit Houston pretty frequently, I'm sorry to say. But 40% of the rain was extra. Not only that, but they're getting stronger faster. More of them are stronger. They're moving more slowly. And of course, you just saw that with not a hurricane, with a tropical storm. They're sitting over us for longer, and they're also getting bigger. So we're seeing the dice are getting loaded against us, but I don't know if you remember, Hurricane Matthew hit the Carolinas 2 years ago. Before it hit the Carolinas, it went over Haiti, the most impoverished country in North Central America. In the Carolinas, it was responsible for 28 deaths and several billion dollars worth of damage. It devastated Haiti's economy. In some places, it knocked out 90% of their food. They already had cholera in Haiti. And because of that, cholera is transmitted through the water. All of the flooding revived the cholera epidemic, which killed tens of thousands of people. Did climate change cause the cholera? No, of course not. But as we saw here, the poorer we are, the more vulnerable we are to the impacts of a changing climate. And when we look at where people live in poverty today, those are the people who are most vulnerable to how climate change will affect them. It exacerbates hunger. It exacerbates lack of access to clean water. It exacerbates diseases that nobody should be dying from in 2019. Climate change is the hole in the bucket. The only reason I care, and the reason why I'm not an astrophysicist today, is because climate change is a people issue. And here's a radical thought. Remember that verse that we looked at? The verse that says that we are responsible for every living thing on the planet? The radical thought is this. When we look at that verse, which is right here, turns out that we're living things too. So the reason I care about a changing climate is because it does matter to people. It matters to people profoundly. I care about it, yes, because God made us responsible for every living thing, but I care about it because it affects real people, especially the poorest and most vulnerable among us. So lastly, in order to close, I want to ask you this, and be thinking about your questions, remember? You can write them on a piece of paper, or you're going to be able to text them in, and you can upvote the questions too, okay? I can't end, though, with talking about what we're supposed to do about this, because a number of years ago, when I first wrote my book with my husband, I was invited to a meeting of Christians to talk about this issue in Austin, Texas. I arrived at the meeting, and one of the people there said, he said, every time you turn on your car, you're sinning. And I thought to myself, really? So not only was coming here a sin, but when I go to work, I'm sinning. When I drive to church, I'm sinning. When I take my child to school, I'm sinning. When I go to the doctor, I'm sinning. Really? I just wanted to go find a Hummer and drive circles around him, preferably with the window open. Sinning. But that isn't biblical either. How are we to respond as Christians? We are told not to respond with guilt, but with love, and not to respond with fear, but with hope. Guilt and fear come at us from the world, on both sides. Fear of what will happen if we don't fix this thing, fear of what will happen if we do. People say it'll destroy the economy, not recognizing that we have more jobs in solar now than coal. People say, you're horrible people, how can you do this? Not realizing that we're free. God has made us free. But my favorite verse has nothing to do with creation or anything like that. My favorite verse is when Paul wrote to Timothy, and of course Paul was mentoring Timothy. And Paul wrote to Timothy, and he gave him a litmus test. He said, God hasn't given us a spirit of fear. So if our attitude and our reaction to something is fear-based, that's not from God. What has God given us? God has given us a spirit of power to act, not be paralyzed, but to act, a spirit of love to care for others more than ourselves, and my personal favorite, a sound mind, to make good decisions based on real information, which include studying the creation that God has given us. So what can we do about this? I was asked to give a TED Talk last year, and I said, I want to do a TED Talk on the most important thing that any single person can do about this. And they said, that's lovely, but we have a TED Talk on light bulbs. I said, that's okay, I wasn't going to do light bulbs. They said, we also covered recycling. I said, no, I didn't want to talk about recycling either. So they said, what do you want to talk about? I said, I want to talk about how, when we ask people across the country, do you think this is real? Do you think it affects plants and animals? Do you think it affects future generations? Everybody pretty much says yes. And then when you ask people, do you think it affects you? Everybody says no. And then when you say, do you ever hear anybody talk about it? Do you ever talk about it yourself? It is a resounding no across the whole country. And connect the dots here. If we don't talk about it, why would we care? If we don't care, why would we ever do anything about it? So the single most important thing that any single person can do, whoever we are, no matter how big or small, is talk about it. And this is my TED Talk. And they've showed that if we have conversations with our friends, with our family, with people we know, we might find more people actually agree with us than we thought. And those conversations are positive, and they can often be very constructive, not if we begin by dragging out the science and hitting somebody over the head with it. And I hope you don't feel like I did that with you tonight. I like science, so I hope you enjoy the science and I wasn't hitting you over the head with it. But rather talking about how it matters to us here in Houston. We are seeing much heavier rainfall events. Neighborhoods are being flooded, especially low-income areas. We're seeing scorching heat in summer. You might not remember the drought, but the drought had a huge impact on Houston. It killed, I forget how many trees, tens of thousands of trees, and had a big impact on water supply. We are being hit right here in the places where we live, but not just talking about what's happening, but talking about what we can do about it. How churches are putting solar panels on their roof. You know how hard it is to put, this is really 1,100 years old, and it took them a lot of paperwork to get permission for those. We can talk about what Christian colleges are doing. It turns out food waste, heat-trapping gases from food waste, are actually one of the biggest sources after what type of energy we use. And so instead of throwing out a third of the food that we eat, that we grow, which is actually how much we throw out, isn't that awful? Saving it and actually not wasting food and providing more food for people who need it. Christian colleges like Taylor University in Indiana putting a white roof on their building, which reflects energy and saves money. Corporations going with clean energy sources. What's happening right here in Texas? Did you know we have the first carbon neutral airport in the US? And I'm sorry to say it's in DFW, it is not in Houston. Fort Hood is saving over $150 million with clean energy. We've got over 35,000 jobs in clean energy. Around the world, Morocco has the biggest solar farm in the world, and the United Kingdom has the biggest offshore wind farm in the world. And why is Texas not on this list? Because China has more wind and solar energy than anyone else. Again, I don't think these names should be on the list. I think we could do better. But individually, we can join a Christian community like climatecaretakers.org, where they email you something every month and they say, here's something we can do personally, and very importantly for us, here's something we can pray about. Because that's what we do as Christians. We work in community, we talk in community, and we need to be having conversations in community about surprising solutions, which aren't just energy related. Some of them are agricultural, like burning agricultural waste and plowing it back into the ground, where it's like Miracle Grow on steroids, and it improves crop production in poor areas of the country. This is from an amazing website called Project Drawdown. Clean cook stove programs save lives from air pollution and also reduce deforestation. Educating women and girls, their babies live longer, so we don't need to have as many, and they have much better lives. And number 3 on this list is actually food waste again, because it produces a huge amount of heat-trapping gases. So the bottom line is this: none of these objections are true. And not only that, not only is this agreeing with this, it's not inconsistent with who we are. If we truly believe what the Bible says and we take it seriously, we'd be at the front of the line on this issue. Because caring about God's creation, which includes people and every living thing that's already being affected by a changing climate today, it is a genuine expression of our faith. It is a faithful acceptance of our responsibility, and most importantly, it is a true expression of God's love. Because to conclude with the words of the Apostle Paul, the only thing that counts is when our faith expresses itself through love. Thank you.
What effect on weather does it have when the government seeds the sky?
Oh, so in West Texas, there's still some cloud seeding happening. But the impact of that is extremely localized. What they're doing is they're trying to it turns out that we don't get rain unless there's little dust particles for the water to condense around. Now, you wouldn't believe there isn't enough dust in West Texas, but once in a while there isn't. So they send up a plane and they give clouds a little bit of seeding to make them rain, but it actually makes some people really mad because when it rains here, that means it doesn't rain here. So that's what they've been doing. They've been doing it for the last 50 years, very localized, but they're not doing it at the global scale. And there's a lot of myths around this, the idea that there's chemicals coming out of airplanes, or that there's these big geoengineering experiments coming in. And what we have is on YouTube, which is where this is being live streamed right now. On YouTube, I have a little series called Global Weirding. Not warming, weirding. Because that's what we're seeing. You know, the dice are being loaded against us, and it's really weird. So Global Weirding has 35 super short little videos, about 5 or 6 minutes long, and we have one called What is Geoengineering? And that's the one that gets all into that. But what I want to share with you is something really cool. And we're getting a ton of questions here too, which is good. What I want to share with you is something really cool. Of all the videos we did, which talk about climate and weather, I have a video about Texas that talks about what's happening in Texas. You know which video has the most views of any episode? What does the Bible say about climate change? That's the one everybody wants to watch.
Okay, well, let's bounce around and see what's been bumped up. How did climate denial get worked into our political system, and what can we do about it?
Wow, that really is the question. It has gotten to the point now, and this absolutely breaks my heart, where the number one predictor of whether we agree that God's creation is telling us that it is getting warmer, and we scientists really have checked everything. I didn't even talk about volcanoes or anything like that, but we've checked everything. The number one factor that explains whether we agree with science that goes back to the 1850s or not is not how much we know about the science, and it's not how smart we are, it's simply where we fall on the political spectrum. But as my husband said, so I've stolen his line, a thermometer is not Democrat or Republican. It doesn't give us a different answer depending on how we vote. But you know what? The solutions are political. They are. But we need solutions across the whole political spectrum. So what has happened is we see liberal solutions, we see socialist solutions, we actually have bipartisan solutions. Did you know that George Shultz and Jim Baker and other Bush-era Republicans, they actually support a price on carbon? And there's a bill before the House right now that's a bipartisan bill supported by Democrats and Republicans to put a price on carbon. So that's pretty interesting. But on the right-hand side of the spectrum, where are the free market solutions? Where are the libertarian solutions? Where are solutions consistent with the right-hand side of the political spectrum? They are MIA. Now, there are some people. Bob Inglis is a former Republican congressman from South Carolina. He is also a man of faith. He is a Presbyterian himself. And he has an institute that actually looks at free market solutions. There's the Niskanen Institute that looks at libertarian solutions, but we aren't hearing about them, so we feel like the only solutions are on one side of the spectrum, and if we're not that type of person, we don't vote for those. And it's because, unfortunately, a lot of people have kind of done the math, and they've figured out, hey, I make a ton of money one way, and we just need to keep using these types of energy because we make more money that way. Now, don't get me wrong, we need energy, and fossil fuels have brought us tremendous benefits, and I'm very, very grateful for them. And pulling the plug today would be worse than stopping them eventually. But we are transitioning, as we did 100 years ago, as Grandma Lucy did, from horses and buggies to cars. In the same way, a lot of companies, including many of the big companies, are starting to transition, recognizing that they know energy, they understand energy, and we need to get energy in new ways. But a few people have decided that that's not what they want to do, and that's how this whole thing has got politicized, by people who tell us that a thermometer does give us a different answer when it doesn't.
Okay, so is it true that wind turbines cost more energy to build than they will produce?
Oh, only if they last for less than 6 months.
And most of them last longer, I'm
Most
assuming?
of them last quite a bit longer than that, yes.
All right.
But if they only lasted 6 months, then that would be true.
Okay, if we overcorrect, will we speed a future ice age?
Oh, that's a good question. At this point, we have indefinitely delayed the next ice age for at least 10,000 years.
So we'd be in the clear.
We are pretty safe on that one. But to be perfectly honest, that's why we want to keep some of our, especially our oil and gas resources, we want to keep them because in the future we might need them for that purpose.
The permafrost is melting. Is this the tipping point? Can the permafrost be refrozen?
Well, the interesting thing is they're looking at technology. There's a technology called thermosiphon where they put it into the permafrost to draw heat out because they're trying to protect not only the roads and not only people's homes, but they're trying to protect all the oil pipelines that go across the permafrost. And the permafrost is thawing, and we were just up there, and as the permafrost thaws, what people don't realize is in what's permanently frozen ground, there are ice veins. We went into the Permafrost Tunnel, and if you go to my Instagram account, you can see pictures of the Permafrost Tunnel. As you go into this tunnel in the ground, you see frozen ground, and then you see ice veins. Some of them are this wide, some of them are this wide, and when those ice veins melt, the land on top just goes boom. Anywhere from a few inches to a couple of yards. It just drops. And so when you're driving around Fairbanks, all of the roads there, if you get carsick, don't go to Fairbanks because the roads are like this. And there's road crews out working on them all the time, and it's because of all the thawing permafrost. So it's putting all our infrastructure at risk, and there's short-term ways to kind of keep a handle on it, temporarily in certain places, but long-term you cannot refreeze the entire Arctic. So the best thing to do is take our foot off the gas pedal before it all thaws.
Why have you not taken your lecture to China?
Who says I haven't?
I think this person assumed you hadn't.
Oh, well, I have. Yes. I have taken this anywhere people will invite me. I don't push my way in. I don't like doing that. If you had not invited me, I would not have been banging on the door. I'm really delighted to talk to anybody, and I've had fantastic conversations with many of our natural resource companies here in Texas. I talk to water managers frequently. I talk to cities, including Houston, very often. So I love to talk with anybody who wants to talk with me, and I have talked with China, and I have to say, it's actually a really humbling experience because we have this idea, and we've learned, and we knew a while ago, that they were building a new coal-fired power plant a year. We knew in the Beijing Olympics the air quality from coal was so terrible they had to actually shut down a bunch of the plants or else the athletes wouldn't run. So we have this image of what's happening in China, and what we don't realize is that they live there, and they know that, And so they're actually shutting down their coal-fired power plants. They've shut down permanently all of the ones around Beijing. Don't believe me, you can Google it. They're spending $300 billion in 3 years to install new clean energy. They're doing hydropower, they're doing wind, they're doing solar, they're doing biomass, they're planting trees in the billions across northern China. They are frankly, and this is very worrying, they are frankly beating the pants off the United States and every other country in the new clean energy economy. And we need energy because that is what runs our economy.
Okay, so
we have a bunch of
we've got it. Let's go back to these, but yes. I have to put on glasses to read these. So at the top of the list at this point, what's your eschatology view of the end times?
Oh, yes.
And how does it affect your thinking on this subject?
Yes, that's a really good one. One of the arguments I didn't get into is the idea if the world's going to end anyways, why does it matter, right? But here's the thing, humans are humans. And back when Paul was writing his letters, there were people who said that back then. In fact, in Thessalonians, there was a group of people who, reading between the lines, basically said, well, Christ is returning very soon, so we'll just quit our jobs. Why work? Sit around. And Paul wrote to them, and he said, in his own inimitable way, he basically told them to get a job, support their families, care for the orphans and the poor and the widows. We don't know the day or the time, so do something, what you're supposed to be doing. And what are we supposed to be doing? We're supposed to be walking in the good works that are prepared for us in advance. We're supposed to be expressing our faith through love. But then, of course, the Reformed tradition holds that we are to participate in redeeming creation, and that is actually part of our job, is to be restoring creation. And whether we believe the world will end or not anyways, and as a scientist, I believe it eventually will, because our sun will grow into a giant red ball and take over the earth. But whether we believe that Christ's return is imminent or not, whether we believe that we will return to this physical planet or a new planet that he creates or not, the point of the Bible, all through the New Testament, is we have a job to do, and our job is to love others as we have been loved. So,
I believe it was Martin Luther who said, if I knew the world was ending tomorrow, I'd still plant a tree today.
Ooh, all right.
Of course, that could have been something that's an internet rumor, but I think he said that.
Yes.
All right. One last question, and then...
and then let's go to one here.
And then, let's do... Helpful. All right, which one do you like here?
I like number 3.
Okay.
Can we do number 3?
Number 3, average people cannot study climate in detail. Should we trust experts? I would add, which experts?
Yeah, exactly.
And what criteria should we use?
Well, this is the tough one, right? Because when we get on the internet, you can see almost anything. So, right? Like literally, there is almost anything, including the whole flat earth thing, which we will not get into tonight.
You're not a flat earther, huh?
No, but we have somebody at Texas Tech who studies it.
John Calvin was a flat earther.
Was he really?
He really was.
Oh.
Go ahead.
A lot of people were in those days.
Yeah, yes. It was a thing.
Although the Greeks were the first to calculate, back in the day, the distance from the sun to the earth. They actually calculated it 2,000 years ago, which is pretty mind-blowing. Yes.
Okay, go ahead, sorry.
Good sources. So what I do is I try to provide this information to people because this is one of the biggest questions I get. So I'm very active on social media. I use Twitter and Facebook and Instagram. I recommend skepticalscience.com because not only is it factual, I know the person who does it personally. He is a believer and he has the same commitment to truth that I do. But I also served as an author for the U.S. National Climate Assessment, the one that was released most recently by this administration. The U.S. National Climate Assessment is a really great resource of up-to-date information on what is happening in the United States, how real people are being affected, what it means to our water, to our food, to our economy, to national security. I didn't even talk about that tonight. And it is a very reputable source. So our global weirding series on YouTube, I try to post new information all the time on social media, especially if there's some rumors going around that aren't true, like if the Amazon's burning down, we won't have any oxygen left. I try to post about things like that. No, that's not true. But I also do definitely recommend the National Climate Assessment and Skeptical Science if you want to dig a little bit deeper.
Okay, one of the things that I found interesting that's a little more personal, because some people ask some personal questions, is you are careful about flying somewhere to speak unless you put more than one event, in essence, into a trip. You don't just fly for one. And I think your Alaska experience is a marvelous one. Would you share that with us, please?
Sure. So I'm a big believer in walking the talk You know, the irony that we scientists fly around the world to talk to people about stuff when we're flying in airplanes that are, of course, powered by fossil fuels, and I'm very grateful for them. I don't know about you, but I do not want, personally, to take a ship or a sailboat around the world. I like being able to fly. So I stepped on the carbon scales, and I found out, well, the biggest part of my personal footprint, me as a scientist and the person I am living here, is my travel. Now, it's really cool. Did you know that United Airlines, their flights out of the LA airport are actually on biofuels already? You can fly normal planes on biofuels. Continental out of Houston was the first person to try it. So change is happening, but I found that out, so I decided, well, what we need to do, first of all, I said, well, does it make a difference if I'm here in person or not? So we were doing an experiment right then at Houghton College. Now, Houghton College is a small Wesleyan college in upstate New York. And at Houghton College, they wanted to see if attending a talk actually made a difference in people's attitudes or not. And I said, well, this is a great thing to test, because if it doesn't, I should just quit, right? There's no point doing it if it doesn't make a difference. So we were designing the experiment to ask students questions before and then after. And they said, well, what about this? When the students show up, could you funnel half of them into a room where I'm here, whoops, in person, and half of the students into a room where they're watching a video that I recorded the day before of the exact same talk? So we did that. And we found two pieces of good news. First, there was a difference in people's opinions before versus after attending a talk, which was, I guess, good. I could keep on doing this. But second of all, there was no difference between video versus in person. So that's why I started to do global weirding, and now I do about 80% of my talks virtually, through Zoom or Skype or Hangout or Facebook Live. I use that polling that I showed you to ask people questions and get people to respond as I talk to them, whether I'm giving presentations in the UK or India or across the US or Canada. And then when I do travel, I bundle my events, so I'm doing multiple events in one place. And when I went to Alaska, they really took this to heart. They knew I wanted to do it, and they're like, we want to get you to come to Alaska, but it's really far. So we are going to organize among churches, scientists, universities, community groups. We're going to organize 30 events in 5 days, which was the equivalent, I calculated, it's the equivalent of taking my little hatchback, which is a plug-in hybrid. It's equivalent to taking my little hatchback and driving to Abilene to give a talk. That was pretty good. A lot of chocolate was needed, fair amount of coffee. But we had a fantastic time, and the Permafrost Tunnel was amazing. So again, if you want photos, check out Instagram, because it was mind-blowing.
Okay. Oops. Last question, and then one announcement. And while I'm making the announcement, we'll have Charles take Catherine over there so y'all can visit with her. She may need to yes. What are your thoughts on the plastics that can be destructive to the planet, and how much of a factor is plastic waste on climate change?
Yes. So plastics are a problem. We know that they're getting into the furthest reaches of the ocean. We're finding birds and marine creatures with plastic in their stomach. We don't even know what the impact of microplastics are on our health, but we know that they're in our bodies, which is kind of scary. But we also know that they don't produce many heat-trapping gases, hardly any. So they're not affecting climate change, but you know what they're doing? They're adding more stress to the system. So you know when you're overworked and you're run down and you haven't had a lot of sleep, that's when you get sick, right? There's multiple things going on. So in the same way, when we look at the health of our air and our water and our food, everything that we depend on to keep ourselves alive, there's multiple things that are affecting it. And the only reason we care about climate change is because it's what the US military calls it. And I want to leave you with this thought because I think it's a really good one. The military calls climate change a threat multiplier. We don't care about an increase in the average temperature of the planet. I mean, frankly, who cares? If it doesn't affect us, why does it matter? We care about it because it exacerbates the problems we already have today, and I care about it because it exacerbates poverty, hunger, water quality, air quality, the quality of our food, the security of our lives. Everything that makes our lives good on this planet are being affected, and plastics are just another piece that's making it even harder. It's kind of like a camel that already has a lot on its back. Then along comes climate change, and it's a big, giant bale of hay that just gets dumped on that camel's back. And then you're like, oh, we forgot the plastics. Here's another little piece of hay we're going to throw on that camel too. And the camel's legs are just kind of going like this at this point. So that's where that all fits together.
Okay, would you join me in thanking Catherine very much? Dr. Hayhoe, thank you.